Hello, welcome all this evening. Welcome to Johns Hopkins SAIS Europe for those of you who are coming from the broader Bologna community, and welcome to all of our students again. It's a real pleasure to have you for tonight's discussion. I'm Nina Hall. I'm an Associate Professor of International Relations here, and we have two guests with us, Joanne from Queen Mary College London, and Ludovica Curzi from the University of Bologna, who I will introduce in full. But before we launch into today's session, I do want to say this is a slightly unusual event because it's part of our festival that we have been running, the University of Bologna, SAIS Europe, and Le Serre Kilowatt. We have had over the last 5 days a festival of ecological imagination, sensing the climate, and this is one of the last events. This festival has had a whole mix of events. Just hands up who has been able to attend. I'm just keen to see a few hands. Great. That's awesome. We'll hopefully get to hear from you at some point, formally or informally, about what you attended. For those who didn't, the festival included music, performances, artists, debates. We also had a session with Joanne on Saturday morning with two artists from Mali Vile who have interspecies diplomacy performance where they talk about what does it mean to have a diplomacy between different species, not just between, as we do here, between different countries. And the reason I'm saying this is because tonight's discussion is partly inspired by the festival and by these ideas of different kinds of imaginations. What might we in future, or could we, or do we in different worlds and different places engage or consider our relationships with the living world, with the other than or non-human? So it is going to be a bit maybe thought-provoking, take us beyond what some of us conventionally sit and read in academic books, but it will also relate to the very world politics of what it means to do international policy making, to work in international courts, because both of the experts we have here have a lot of experience both studying and even working within them. But before I go too far, I actually want to do something we don't always do at SAIS, and I want you to turn to somebody next to you who you don't know. I want you to introduce yourself and say, if you were at the festival, what you enjoyed, what you didn't, what you learned from it. And if you didn't get to the festival, maybe just a reaction to the panel of today, which is how do international policymakers sense nature? Do you have an immediate reaction to this when you walked into the room? So take 5 minutes just to speak to one or two people next to you about that.
I got myself very happy to my friends I sent him and I managed to open because he was working in the space he managed to Oh, sweet. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this been something having all yeah, and it's slightly unusual by out to the people. They like, oh, I think you guys are redundant. You can go redundant. I think we are wrong. I should do this. That's more than that.
All right. I'm very happy to see such a lively debate. I was saying to the speakers that maybe they could go have a drink because everyone seemed to be in having such a good conversation. I felt like I could leave you to it. I just wanted, partly because I mentioned the festival, anyone that was at the festival that wants to throw in anything that they took away from the weekend of activities. Anyone? No volunteers? Oh, wow. Do you want to elaborate? What?
I was more focused on our side of the United States, and also a lot of meditative aspects that I had not. I'm reworked my own thinking, my relationship with the environment. I love flying. I reflect every exercise about things and what the black something happens, how it works out and balance that part. How it's possible.
Thanks for that. And thanks for volunteering, Logan. It was really great. Well, I hope that there's reflection that happens beyond today's formal panel, because for me, one of the joys of running a festival is to get you to think, in all of us, myself included, in different ways with different audiences, and being a bit like bold and experimental, and the arts can bring us that. So without further ado, I will get into today's panel, but hold on to the thoughts that you might have shared also with each other about your reactions also to the question, because there'll be a lot of time for Q&A. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce both of our speakers. I have about 4 questions for them. So that'll probably take us about 40 minutes of time. And then it's over to you. Like, we should have a good 40 minutes of discussion, and I will collect as many questions from all of you as possible. Now, as a sort of background to why I set up this question, how do international policymakers sense nature? I do think it's worth noting a couple of things, that there has been significant change over time, and we can explore that question of how they have changed over time, as well as a lot of differences between different countries. So my own country, New Zealand, for instance, was one of the first places to recognize a river as having legal personhood. That's the Whanganui River. We can also learn about other interesting innovations in the legal space, but it's not just in law. It can also be seen through international institutions, as we'll hear from Joanne, but beyond that, in the different ways that different cultures and different people may engage with the living world. So Joanne has come to us from London. She is a reader or associate professor in international relations at Queen Mary University of London. Her research interests include environmental history and politics, the history of empire and imperialism, and cooperation and conflict through international organizations. She has a BA in history for the University of Chicago, an MA in IR from Johns Hopkins, including spending a year here in Bologna, so she's an alumni, and received a PhD from the London School of Economics. Her first book was The Ideal River. I can highly recommend it. How Control of Nature Shaped the International Order. And if you haven't, you're interested in global environmental politics, and those of you who might end up take my class, we will read sections of it. But even if you aren't, I would highly recommend the book. It won the British International Studies Association's 2023 Ling Outstanding First Book Prize and the International Studies Association's Sprout Award for the best book published in environmental studies. And I was actually on the committee that year, so I can tell you it was an outstanding lineup of books, but this was by far the best. Then we have Ludovica Curzi, who's come all the way from 100 meters just over here, our faculty, the law department. So thanks for joining us, the long walk across the road. And she is an associate professor of international law at the University of Bologna in the Department of Legal Studies, a lead trainer for Geneva Academy for International Human Rights and Humanitarian Law in a course which is on human rights and the environment. She's been a visiting fellow at the Lauterbach Center for International Law, the University of Cambridge, Columbia Center, and at Sciences Po School in Paris. She's also an expert to the Office of the State Attorney of the Republic of Italy in cases before the European Court of Human Rights, as well as in an investor-state arbitration. And she regularly works as counsel before international courts and tribunals, including the International Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights, and was involved in recent discussions at the International Court of Justice that you might have followed on the advisory opinion, which came out this June. But the hearings were held in December last year, right? So she has a whole lot of experience both writing and working in international legal bodies. So I'm really happy to have you both here today. It's wonderful to have people with such rich expertise and experience in these issues. So I'm going to take a seat when. So Joanne, the first question is for you. And given your book, The Ideal River, one of the strengths of the book talks so much about river commissions, some of the earliest international organizations created to govern rivers. How were states thinking then, back in the 19th century, about nature? And how were European diplomats involved in these river commissions and setting them up, considering rivers and the environment?
Hello, this is working. Yes, excellent. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Very kind, Nina. And thank you to all of you for giving up your Monday evenings to be with us. So the first question is about how did states conceptualize nature, right, in the 19th century, and diplomats along with those states. So essentially, I would argue that states conceptualize nature as resources for state development. They conceptualize nature as what Jason Moore calls cheap, which is essentially free except for the cost of discovering it, extracting it, and processing natural resources. If you think about the control of nature, or the taming of nature, there are obvious economic benefits, right? For example, by controlling a river, you can transform once useless floodplains into useful spaces for agriculture, for homes, for factories. You can harness the river for sanitation, for power production. You can even create, what I talk about in the book, you could create a rational highway that would then facilitate trade, where you could take goods from one space to another very easily. But I would also argue that in addition, and in tandem, in fact, with those economic benefits, in reclaiming land from swampy disuse, the state can bring rationality and order to spaces. So there's a moral benefit that comes hand in hand with the economic benefits. And by making conquests from barbarism, they can bring progress to their lands and their people. And in the early modern period, in particular, the ability to tame and extract value from nature became a hallmark of a well-run state, a modern state, in fact. Scholars of this period of time, early modernity, have argued that during this period, political legitimacy shifted from one based on interpersonal ties to one based on territorially bound rule. And you can think about this, the nation state of today as governed by the same concept of political legitimacy. And the control of nature played a role in this transition by allowing the state to consolidate what sociologist Chandra Mukherjee calls logistical power, or the power derived from controlling and shaping the natural world. One way the ruling classes demonstrated this was via landscaping to show their mastery over nature. A famous example of this is Louis XIV's Versailles. Many of you probably have at least seen photos of it, and how pretty much every blade of grass and every droplet of water spoke of royal power and control. And it legitimated the absolute state of Louis XIV as somehow natural, inevitable, and true. And symbolically, this type of power draws from Judeo-Christian notions of legitimate stewardship over God's domain and sort of a sense of restoration of the Garden of Eden. But I think it has international implications as well. So in my book, I argue that at least there's the twofold international implications here. First, if a natural resource becomes transboundary, for example, my book is about transboundary rivers such as the Rhine and the Danube, then control and taming of this resource required interstate cooperation. And I argue that this enabled the first intergovernmental organizations of the 19th century along these two transboundary rivers. But second, this way of legitimating rule over territory has imperial implications, in that the colonial state can then legitimate claims over colonial territory based on their superior ability to master and take care of nature. Here, I'm really inspired by Diana Davis's work. She wrote a book called Resurrecting the Granaries of Rome, which shows how the French colonial state makes such a claim in North Africa, where they argue that the superior French sciences and superior French management can restore the desert to fertility, what once was the granaries of the Roman Empire.
And just as a provocative follow-up to that, how did the river respond to this?
It's a great question. And something I do try to at least touch on in the book is that the river offered resistance against perhaps diplomats' efforts to tame it. If what the states are trying to create is a straightened, rational, frictionless river, then what the river did was put up resistance against that, right? So for every time that the state would try to, they were blowing up rocks and islands within the river to kind of straighten it, so that basically rocks in the middle of the river creates eddies, and that's bad for shipping. So they were trying to blow up these rocks so that you can have a straight highway without these rocks and eddies and waterfalls. But every time they tried to do that, the river would respond and would not be tamed in certain ways. And so in treating the river itself as a character in international politics, it's not just about the state and what the state's trying to do, but also the resistance that the river is putting up. There's an episode at the beginning of the book about how they're trying to basically dredge the river. So if you dredge the river runs, basically didn't want it to flood. So they thought if you dredge the river, it would run faster. And then when the spring melts came, it would just go down the river. But what happened was it actually created larger floods further down the river because all the floodwaters were coming in at once. And what happened before with the floodplains is it syncopated some of the water that was coming down. So it would allow it to kind of breathe almost, that it would flood and a bit and then come back down. But because it didn't allow it to flood at the upper reaches of the river, all that water hit downriver even faster, creating even greater floods and damage. So it's interesting to see how, all of the science that's being mobilized at this time is trying to create this rational, tamed object, and how the river is much more complicated than they could imagine.
And I just want to acknowledge as well, for many of us in the room who were in Bologna during the floods, these questions are obviously still relevant. And I know one of my colleagues here who may ask a question later, Sarah Parkinson, is teaching a class on exactly these topics of, emergency management and how are we dealing with this? Ludovica, what's your view on these questions of how states, say 100 years ago, in the sort of legal sphere have thought about nature? Do you have any kind of broad insights?
Well, I think that international environmental law is, I mean, speaking from a lawyer's perspective, is fairly young as a discipline, and the way we know it. But of course, this doesn't mean that we didn't have cases before, you know, the usual cases that we mentioned that we know. Back in the days, what the discussion about nature was very much a discussion about resources, management of resources, and heavily based on the management of those resources, right? So of course, in a circle of states, back in the days, a small circle, then of course a much bigger circle, the main issue was the management of resources. And so the damages, environmental damages, were very much perceived as damages to potential resources. Now, this has changed. We know that there's been a huge development in that sense. And although, I mean, there are some states that still sort of focus on the right to manage environmental resources. But I would say that there's been a huge revolution in that perspective from and very much resources-oriented perspective to what we know as the protection of global public interests. And civil society has stepped in, something that we didn't have back in the days. We've had courts stepping in. We'll devote some time to it. But I would say that the revolution here has been the creation of a system within the United Nations where individuals have access to committees that monitor the environmental treaties. They have access to human rights committees that deal with human rights issues. So the human rights approach to environment, which is relatively recent compared to other aspects of the environment. So it's a very fragmented field from an international law perspective. We didn't have institutions. Now we start to have institutions devoted to it. It's still quite fragmented. We have hundreds of treaties dealing with the environment. We don't have one single machinery dealing with it. We don't have a world court on the environment, although there's been a discussion about it. Not so recent anymore, but so the environment has been litigated, has been present in international courts, but rather in a fragmented way compared to these days where it's getting more into a unified form.
And when would you pinpoint, I know this is always hard to do, this shift from a management of resources to some other kind of what you talked about as a production of global public interest? Or
I think probably
framework?
the watershed, I mean, it's difficult to pinpoint the exact moment. I think that probably Stockholm Conference in 1972, when we start to look at principles of international environmental law, we start to look at issues such as the protection of the environment as a global common good. We start, and again, followed by the Rio conference in 1992, we look at the principle of sustainable development that has been elaborated during those years. And we look for the first time at the concept of future generations, right? The fact that you cannot manage resources without taking into account the rights of future generations to make use of those resources as well. So I think that probably starting from Stockholm, we start to see the first sort of global common interest approach, and then consolidated in Rio in the 1990s. Yeah.
And I wonder, Joanne, how do you see that in your work? Because of course you've studied river commissions, and now you're studying the Antarctic Treaty and the Outer Space Treaty, which were, post World War II, but a bit earlier. What changes have you noticed in the area you work in, and how states started to think about the living world and the environment?
Yeah. And I guess I come from a very different perspective in that I study imaginaries rather than sort of the specific legal requirements or norms. And so I actually see a lot of continuity, that in many ways nature is still conceptualized as a resource to be harnessed and exploited by states for moral and economic progress. That whether that's economic resources, such as land that could be used to grow crops, underground resources for mining, whether that's oil and gas needed for the fossil fuel economy, or the rare minerals needed for the new green one. Waterways that could be tamed through large-scale hydroelectric dams, and ocean highways necessary for global commerce. And we all remember the Ever Given a few years ago, the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal, which I think reminded many of us the importance of these waterways and what happens if one of them stopped working. I think maybe some of the changes, and reflecting on maybe some of the changes where these imaginaries might occur, is in perhaps the moral value of the environment. I think there's still a need to transform wild places into rational ones for social progress. But nature is maybe increasingly seen as a cultural resource. For example, the rise of national parks that could provide leisure for populations in cities. Now, I think this is kind of double-edged as well, in that nature now becomes this escape and sort of an economic resource of escape, where the tired populations from the cities can go and get rejuvenated, and on Monday morning they can come back and continue to produce. So it's not always necessarily a good story here. But in, thinking about Antarctica and outer space, so if my previous research was on the 19th century, so now I'm thinking about the early to mid 20th century as a moment where sort of these two new spaces came under the purview of international politics, particularly the 1959 Antarctic Treaty System, which was established to govern Antarctica, and then the decade between that and the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which was created to govern space exploration. And actually, if you look at the text and the language of the Outer Space Treaty, a lot of it's based on the Antarctic Treaty in the norms that it's propagating. And again, in many ways, I see a lot of continuity. It's a quest for mastery over the natural world, to take humans into ever more extreme environments so that we can gather more and more data to improve and our knowledge of the universe, while also showing our ability to survive in these extreme climates, which in a way is an act of conquest. That even though it's cold and there's no air, we could still be there and still dominate it. And so in this project, I framed this impulse as epistemic completion. So this notion, this quest to know the Earth in its entirety through the collection of ever-growing amounts of data and knowledge, which helps us to understand Earth as a whole, holistic, integrated system. And it also amplifies a lot of the international cooperation I was talking about with respect to rivers, in that in order to generate all of this data from everywhere all at once, you need even more international cooperation so that you can collect data from everywhere at once. You can't do that without cooperation and almost a central coordination of that cooperation. One of the episodes I study is the 1957-58 International Geophysical Year, where 67 countries and over 60,000 scientists, and this is at the height of the Cold War, where 67 countries from across the Cold War divide cooperated to gather data from around the world for about 18 months. And this, according to US President Dwight D. Eisenhower, gave us new understanding and new power over the forces of nature. So in different ways, it's, I think, very much still about conquest.
And it's really interesting you paint this narrative or find this narrative of continuity of wanting to tame nature. I want to come back to you, Ludovica, because you've been involved both working with Nauru, if I'm not mistaken, with Italy. How do you see differences between how countries today think about and consider nature and the environment in international legal cases? And I particularly raise it for those who don't know, because the ICJ advisory opinion was brought by a group of law students from the University of the South Pacific in Vanuatu, who thought we need to understand exactly what states' obligations are in international law, including under the Paris Agreement, but also other international laws. And I'm sure that many Pacific states have quite different views this is my, hypothesis, which I'm throwing out to you, then, I don't know, the UK or the US or maybe even Italy about how they think about nature and the environment. And how do you see that playing out, the differences between states?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, for those who are not familiar with it, I mean, I know that not everyone has necessarily studied international courts. I mean, there's been a huge wave of litigation, but also that we're experiencing an unprecedented phase where international courts are stating and addressing climate issues. And the International Court of Justice is one of those. It's not the only one. The International Court of Justice, as the principal judicial organ of the UN, it has two functions, right? Just to make it clear. One is the contentious function, so when there's litigation, a state against a state, and then you've got the advisory function, right? That is when the court is asked by an organ or an authorized UN body to interpret and state what the law is with respect to a certain matter. So it's not been the only advisory proceeding concerning climate change. Actually, the first one was the one before the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea. That was that's already concluded, and it ended up with a very important advisory opinion in 2024. So then we have the Inter-American Court also looking at human rights and climate change. We have the International Court of Justice, and then we've got the African Court, which has been recently asked about climate change and human rights, and who's in the process of addressing the question. So what is it about? So the court is asked certain questions. I mean, of course, every different court has different jurisdictions. We can say, I don't want to get into the boring legal details, but the International Court of Justice was asked, what are the obligations of states when it comes to climate change? And what are the consequences? I'm oversimplifying the questions, but what are the consequences when those obligations are breached? What is interesting about this advisory proceeding, as Nina has mentioned, is that it was atypical actually, bottom-up kind of sort of process where a class of students going through international environmental law through the help and assistance of two fantastic academics managed to put together a campaign, which then ended up into the advisory opinion request. So I think that's something quite unheard of, and I advise you to look at the New York Times article about it, because I think it's really interesting, and it describes the dynamics in the class that led to that campaign. And I think it's really interesting because it really tells us how civil society is leading this process, and how we're witnessing a sort of cross-cutting civil society that is making sure that courts keep their eyes open on the environment. So advisory proceedings, they don't end up into a binding, right, decision. They end up into an opinion which is technically non-binding. So normally my students as lawyers, they're like very skeptical. So what's the impact, even that they're not binding? Actually, they do produce a lot of legal effects, a lot of political effects. And actually, it's been recently published a decision against Canada, where there was a reference to the ICJ advisory opinion. I think I saw it today, so I haven't had the time to read it yet. But I think it's not just litigation-wise. Of course, the ICJ and the participation that leads to the opinion is very important. So whatever I've seen, I'm a Western-based and Western-trained lawyer. So for me, it was really interesting to see the different approaches. So it's an unprecedented exercise where so many states joined forces, and, well, not joined forces, but presented their observations to the court and their approach. And states participate in these proceedings because they they present what their positions are to the court, and then the court sort of take into account these pleadings and comes up with the opinion. So as you may imagine, and as Nina mentioned, the approach by certain small island states was very different from the approach by certain Western countries, including big emitters. I mean, I won't go through the all 100 and plus submissions, but I think if we want to sort of draw a picture, I think what struck me about the submissions of some of the Pacific Islands states was the sense of urgency that was in the submission, and the reference to the spiritual dimension of nature. That is something that, of course, you don't find in the submissions by some, well, the majority of Western states. In the case of Nauru, I was working for Nauru, so we had a very sort of tailored and succinct kind of submission. But if you look at Vanuatu, you can find the submissions online, by the way, and they're very interesting to read. If you look at the submission by Vanuatu, there are a lot of interesting, well, it's 200 pages opinion. You find a lot of different references to the spiritual and the ancestral nature of well, ancestral aspect of nature. You then have, of course, the position of African states. Well, you got this sense of community that's linked to nature, so the social dimension of nature that was stressed in many of the state submissions. The African Union also presented its own submission, and here a strong reference also to nature as the foundation of community life, which I think is a very interesting concept. And of course, the ancestral bonds that define social identity of a country. And then, one could also mention the South American states, which have different approach. I know I won't be too long, but I think the interesting concept of Pachamama, you might have heard of it, and the strong reference to the rights of nature. And we know that South American states have quite a trend in terms of protection of rights of nature. And here we've got references to Mother Earth, we've got references to the buen vivir, so it's like living in harmony with nature in the submissions. And then again, we'll still have countries that refer to the resources, right? The issue of the right to development. And here I'm referring, for example, to India. The idea that the state has the right, I mean, some states who didn't make most of their resources, but in the past, they have the right to use those resources as, to the best of their potentialities now. So that this is the clashing and the sort of the tension that we have, right? The environmental protection from one side, and then we've got the idea that, of course, some states, feel that they want now to sort of, now that they want to make the most of their resources. And then, the Western states, I mean, there would be a lot to say, but I think what's interesting is the very sort of technocratic procedural lens that many Westerns, like very dry lens that many Western states adopted in the proceedings comprehensively. And of course, this just to make a very long story short, but many Western states argued that the only relevant rules were the rules under the Paris Agreement. And so the Paris Agreement is the lens through which we want to look at this. We don't need to go into other rules. We don't need to go into other principles. And luckily, the court didn't buy this view and confirmed that that you have to look into the whole body of international rules, and there's much more. And why is this relevant? Because of course the Paris Agreement is from 2015, right? But we have obligations, and we had obligations in place way before then, right? And so this brings us to the issue of historical responsibility, and and of course brings a lot of legal issues to the fore. But I think that you can see that there was really, I mean, if we want to see it from a optimistic perspective, it was a very good exercise where states could sort of present their different positions. But I think what is very important is that those positions were shaped by civil society to a great deal. much more than what states would admit, I think. But I think that there was a strong civil society movement beyond submissions.
Thanks for that. I'm going to ask one more question before I open up. So I'm sure you've all got lots of questions ready, but if you haven't, now's your chance to start thinking. Just to throw out maybe in the spirit of the festival of, ecological imagination, of thinking about the climate and nature, is there one sort of interesting area in your respective fields of expertise where you can see a change? That's how and whether or not how states are forming international organizations and the agreements. I mean, I know, Joanne, you've told us you just see continuity and you see this kind of mastery over, but I wonder, particularly because you were at the festival and you engage with the artists, Marley Vile, is there anything that you found really interesting and different in terms of imaginations of nature? And same for you in the courts, beyond the advisory opinion, because as you said very clearly, like lots of national courts, lots of, is legal personhood. You can get into whole debates about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but where do you think is the most edgy, interesting change coming from? Joanne, I don't know if do you want to start?
Or
You can
No, I have to think about that. I think I responded to, the continuity that I've been drawing in my comments, I think, are from a state-centric perspective, and particularly from powerful states. So maybe the ones that have set the current international order, liberal international order, if we want to call it that, and the ones who are invested in it and want to preserve it. So that continuity I continue to see, I think, today, even though a lot of my scholarship is historical. But I think what's interesting, not from the festival, but also from a lot of what Ludovica was saying about the different states bringing up different norms into international discourses and discussions, is a challenging of that international order, where the states, and particularly the powerful states, get to make the normative innovations and get to make the legal innovations as well. This realist idea that it's the powerful states that get to make the rules. And I think there's a real challenging of that, both from a normative perspective, in that, well, actually, there are different ways of thinking, different ways of knowing, different relationships with the natural world that predate the Western system and the international order that we see, but also sort of, I think, a material planetary boundaries argument in which the international system that's been set up for the last 200 years has brought us to the brink of catastrophe. So there is something within it that is actually needs fixing and needs to be transformed if we are to survive as a planet. So I think it's coming from both bits. It's coming from the civil society. It's coming from the normative innovations. In many ways, that innovation is much more grounded in sort of historical continuity. But also it's coming from a place where if we don't do something, we run up against the boundaries, then we're all going to suffocate. Not to end it. Sorry,
Ludovica.
Right. Keep optimistic. No, I think it's a very good question. I think that honestly, I think that the major shift that we're witnessing is the change in terms of like the state as being more unitary in its approach to the environment and to nature, to a state which is more fragmented, but in a good way. So we see that judges are taking up their roles, and it's something that was probably difficult to predict until a few years ago. We see judges that are not just looking at what states are doing, they're questioning what we see domestic judges questioning what governments are doing. And this is thanks to the fact that we've got civil society that's of course using those creative arguments. We see the case in Ecuador, won by frogs. It's often an example.
Is this the one to save the rainforest?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And the idea that that it's the government cannot do whatever it wants to do when it comes to the environment, but there is civil society looking at it, not just through courts. I'm not saying that courts are the solution, but I think that's been the most innovative aspect. And I think it's really bridging the gap between the local and the international dimension. We've seen this dialogue going on between the International Court of Justice, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and domestic courts where local communities are bringing the cases. I mean, we've seen in the courts that I lead in Geneva, I hosted some organization from Alaska. They're bringing a case before the Aarhus Committee. I mean, we see that really, and they didn't know what it was before, and they've been trained, and now they know what the mechanism that the mechanism exists, and they're making use of it. So I think that that is quite again, I think we should be proud of it, and there's much, of course, that we need to fix, and we know that international courts judgments are not always respected, but I think that civil society is really the leading actor at the moment, going from policy spaces to courts, back to policy spaces. And I'm amazed. I mean, I see what civil society does in terms of like students like you. They respond to call for inputs. There are many call for inputs from special rapporteurs, so from the United Nations, on fossil fuels based economies and on issues on the right to a healthy environment and obligations of the private sector, of companies. And we see students in their 20s presenting their views, amazing works. I mean, research carried out with the help of NGOs, with the help of professors, and I think that's fantastic. I mean, just to bring some positive thing we need to be.
No, totally. And it's good to know, because I have a new project starting off on the role of NGOs in climate litigation. So I'm happy to hear that you're on board, that they have an important role. I want to open up the floor to questions from anyone. You can be a student here. You don't need to be a student here. Guests, you're all welcome to ask a question on your mind. I would encourage you to say your name and maybe where you're from. Yeah, we'll start here.
Thank you so much for all of you for this amazing panel. I think it was very, very inspiring to just hear all of your remarks. And I have actually two questions to both of you. Professor Yao, I would be very curious to hear your views on the 30 by 30 campaign, which is pushing for 30% land conservation by 2030, which is on the one hand, obviously a positive thing, but has also been criticized for pushing indigenous peoples from their lands and restricting the way they can use those lands. And to Professor Curzi, I would be very interested in hearing your perspective. As you said, as international law is increasingly under pressure, how you foresee the role of regional regimes like the Inter-American Human Rights regime in pushing and maintaining international legal norms and even advancing them further. Thank you so much.
Remind me your name?
I'm sorry, I'm Hannah.
Hannah. Thanks, Hannah. We'll get a couple of questions. So yeah, here in the front, and then we'll go to the person in the back.
Hello, my name is Ludovica. I'm a student here at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Professor Yao, this is particularly for your questions since you brought up the question of the Outer Space Treaty. I had the opportunity of doing research on space debris and how it's affecting our, space environment. And when we talk about our environments, I think space is often overlooked, especially knowing how dependent we are in our daily functions. So in particular with this, Outer Space Treaty, I found it to be very stagnant, where I think there isn't necessarily any room to adjust the treaty itself to for it to be adaptable to today's space environment, especially with the rapid commercialization of space. So do you think, is this a similar point that you share? And is this something that, if so, is this something that you have also come across within other sectors of the environment?
Great. Thanks. That. We'll take one more and then we'll go.
Well, hello, my name's DJ. I'm from USA. I would what what activists and states can do to bridge the gap between states that are proposing the, the right to development, and how like they kind of spend all this time gathering the resources and capacity to develop their economies and their lands, and those that value preservation and conservation. I feel like there's obviously a huge tension there, but I think from very common grounds for building something new. So how can states and activist groups and stuff bridge that gap?
Right, that sort of links also into Hannah's first question about 30 by 30 conservation and Indigenous peoples. We'll come back for a second round afterwards, if that's all right. I think we've got enough on our plates. Who wants to start?
I'm writing down because of the question, because my memory is very
Joanne, do you have
It's terrible. Okay, yeah, I'll do what I can, and then yeah, thank you very much for the question about 30 by 30, particularly this tension with Indigenous populations. And I think for me, it goes back to something I read about in the book, and I've been thinking about for a long time, is this created division between the human and the non-human. We can call it civilization, society versus nature. There's a lot of ways to think about it. In my research, looking at it historically, it is something that's come about with modernity, that more and more we wanted to see this binary. And that nature is something that's pure and without humans somehow. And then society is over here, and it has to do with culture, etc. Right? And I think this idea that Indigenous populations somehow don't belong in the wild, untamed natural spaces is a product of that division. I see the same kind of issues so I'm American, I'm from the US, and a lot of the environmental history literature has been about the American West, and very much the same issues, in that the first national parks were created in the US to preserve these untamed spaces for the enjoyment of everybody, right? But in many ways, it kind of unimagined Indigenous populations from those spaces, and I would argue engages in an act of violent erasure, as if they weren't there, as if they don't actually belong, because some of the authors in sort of the late 19th century in the US said they were dirty and they didn't belong in the pure nature that we have here. And so I think it's that division and trying to distinguish that somehow Indigenous populations can't be both human and non-human at the same time, or more than human. I think is a problem for which still challenges our thinking around these things. That if we're going to preserve nature, then it has to be without human intervention, when historically it's about the dynamic interaction and engagement between humans and non-humans that have created the world, that there isn't an untouched nature out there, whether we want to think of that as recovery or something we create for the future. I would very much be against thinking about nature as something that's just untouched by human beings, and I think that's created all sorts of violence. So thank you very much for that question. In terms of the Outer Space Treaty, yeah, I think that's really interesting, that the commercialization of space is a question I often get, and whether or not that compares to the Antarctic, which is the comparison I draw, and that it's less commercialized in that way, and there's sort of particular reasons for that. I think a lot of the criticism that I see around the Outer Space Treaty is that it doesn't do enough, right? Like, it's not so much, it's stagnant, and it ossifies us in sort of a particular way of thinking, but it doesn't have any teeth, right? Like, it doesn't actually do what it says it does. Like, if you were talking about making sure it's a demilitarized zone or a place for the peace of mankind, then we're not thinking about how technology is dual use. Pretty much any technology can be dual use, and how states can very easily skirt around some of the norms that have been drawn. And yeah, the commercialization space, I think, is another aspect of it, where states can say, well, it wasn't us, it was Elon, and his rockets that are doing this, and we can't really control how he is using those rockets and what he's doing. But I do think the question of safe debris also is really important, and increasing, well, who's going to clean up the commons, right? This is a question I think that is fundamental to environmental politics. Is there's a commons, and it's a resource that we all want to use, and somebody's polluted it for the good of humanity, apparently. But there's lots of debris out there. At some point, it's going to be a problem fundamentally for, not just, going to space, but GPS, right? Like we Google Maps isn't going to work because of all the garbage that we've put up there. And that is not being talked about and not really addressed with the treaty. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. I think it's a very important question. So what can regional systems do? And regional systems, European Court of Human Rights, or Council of Europe, Inter-American Court, and African Court, they have a great advantage that they're closer to the communities, they're closer to, of course, states. And that is the good news. The bad news is, there are many bad news, but the first bad news is that not every state is, not all states are covered by regional systems. The second bad news is that, as with other international courts, the limit is you can only sue states before those courts, right? You cannot bring a company before the European Court of Human Rights. I mean, until now, we'll see if that's going to change maybe in the future, but you cannot sue private actors. And so that's why we've seen that a lot of contribution has been before domestic courts, where we've got cases against Shell, for example, given its emissions, before Dutch courts. We've got cases before Swiss courts against Holcim, the cement company. We've got cases across different jurisdictions against companies, but that's something we don't have at the regional level. I think that's unfortunately a weakness of those systems, even if private actors can access some of those systems, because actually companies can bring cases before the European Court of Human Rights. That's a bit of contradiction. The third, well, sort of mixed news is that I think it's fantastic that we frame environmental issues through the lens of human rights. I think we've, probably that since 2021, actually, the Human Rights Council recognized the human right to a healthy environment, which means that, technically speaking, it's a justiciable right. You can use that right to go before a court. And I think that's very good. I'm not sure that the human rights lens is always the best lens to approach environmental issues. And I think it forces us to squeeze environmental issues into human rights issues. We've seen a lot of great developments. If you think of the European Court of Human Rights decision against Switzerland, for example, right, brought by a group of elderly women, and the implementation is not going that smoothly, but it's there's a committee of ministers that looking at it. You see the youth group brought the Duarte case brought against 30+ states. So I think again it tells us that there's a lot of potential. There's a big discussion about whether the European Convention of Human Rights should have an additional protocol on the human right to a healthy environment. There's a big campaign about that. Not going that well at the moment, but I mean, it's been there for a while. So I think that regional systems, they have great potential in terms of both contentious jurisdictions, so hearing cases against states, and advisory proceedings. But of course, they're not sort of set up to face environmental issues. And we tend to see climate or environmental issues and human rights always as going hand in hand. They don't necessarily do. I mean, talking about rivers, right? The different functions of a river. If you look at the human rights dimension, so that is drinking water and sanitation, doesn't necessarily sort of coexist well with the environmental protection of the river or other uses that are linked to human rights, right? I mean, the electricity you get out of it, and many of the contents of human rights sometimes can endanger the environmental protection. And that's why I think it's also important that we see nature as a different legal subject. I'm not sure that's going to make a huge difference from a legal standpoint, but I think that it's an added value that we don't just see it through the lens of human rights, but as a self-standing subject. In terms of the difficult question about how to bridge the gap between right to development, I think that international law is, well, from a legal perspective, that's basically what common but differentiated responsibilities is trying to answer, right? The idea that we all have an obligation, all states have obligations, but that obligation is different. Those obligations are different according to what the contribution has been in the past, and what are the capacities of that specific state. Now, it sounds very clear on paper, then the application of it is not that easy. But how to bridge it? I mean, I think that ultimately, even in countries where rightly so they're trying to sort of make the most of their resources, I think that simply speaking, there is no choice at this point, right? So I think that what a lot of activists are doing in a very good way is describing a situation where the environmental urgency is actually a present issue, is not like a future problem you need to solve. If you talk to the people, I mean, I was struck when I was talking to people from the Pacific Islands, right? The time frame they have. Like, you got people of my age saying, well, I'm not sure my kid will be able to see what I see today. So we're talking in the range of 10, 20 years, right? So I think that is well, I'm not sure how to do it, but I think that as a very good advocate said during the pleadings, is like at the end, either a unified civil society pushes for it now, or we'll all be forced to do it and to act after quite unimaginable catastrophes hit us. So I think, well, just to end in another
Another happy note. Let's get some more questions. Yeah, remind me your name.
Yeah, thank you. I think so. I think it's fine. Yeah, thank you for so much of the talk so far. My name is Jamario. I'm from Florida in the US. I attended the Engaging Nature seminar on Saturday, and I wanted to talk about like I wanted to know if you could elaborate on the role that like art plays in shaping academic research, and the potential for it to like break down some of these boundaries in the framework that we have about the environment as something separate from humans, and as something that is to be tamed or exploited for resources.
Thanks for asking that question. There's a question at the back. Mira, and then we've got a question way at the front.
Hi, I'm Mira. I'm Syrian American, and my question is, in what ways has the inclusion of non-traditional evidence reshaped notions of credibility and norms within the international legal system, not just in the climate sphere?
Traditional evidence. And then we have a question right at the front. Sorry. You want to raise your hand so we can see?
Hi both, thank you so much for speaking with us today. My name is Amalia, and my question is actually a futures and imaginary question. I'm currently writing my thesis for the School of Oriental and African Studies in London about linking gender-based violence and violence against women against violence, linking it to violence against nature under the theory of racial capitalism. And in my solutions part, I want to think about applying a futures method to think about these solutions. So I wondered if you can share, like, what does a future look like in which we can live within planetary boundaries? And maybe what scholars, activists, authors could we read if we want to ideate more on that idea about building a world in which we live in planetary boundaries, valuing earth, care, women, former colonies, those sorts of themes. Thank you.
Great. I think that's a pretty big set of questions you've got. So one about the role of art in shaping academic research. I'm also happy to half respond to that, Joanne, but you had lots to say on Saturday. So then from Mira, non-traditional evidence for you, Ludovica, and then I guess one for you both about planetary boundaries and what a future might look like where we actually live within them, because we just overshot our, I think it was acidification of the ozone about 2 weeks ago. Ludovica, do you want to start this time?
Yeah, sure. In terms of what the role of art, I mean, could be, I think that it's funny because, of course, as lawyers, we sometimes are not the best ones to sort of envisage, especially, I mean, international lawyers, I think are they have more creativity than other lawyers, and but still. We're probably a little bit squared in our reasonings, but I think that I think that art. I mean, if I look at as an art consumer, I've seen that there's been an unbelievable focus. You know, if you look at the exhibition in Venice, I mean, for those who are in Italy, of course, I mean, there's been a lot of focus on the climate crisis and the role of art, and I think that. It's a great way to bridge the gap between the community and the institution. And I think even in a place before, like the International Court of Justice, that the idea that that is a very formal place, a very sort of black letter kind of legal environment. I think that the idea that a lot of images and ideas we're taking from civil society through the help of art. I think that's already telling us that art is being used as a very important tool in that respect. In terms of I think that the added value is really sort of to bridge the bridge. I think it also answers a little bit the question that was asked about how to sort of bridge the local and sort of more local dimension with the universal dimension. I think that again, the fact that you've got an increasing relationship between campaigns and artists, so artists helping out campaigns, especially in the youth. And if you look at, for example, it's not necessarily linked to art, but I think it's interesting to see how legal environment are receiving certain arguments and how are they responding to certain arguments. If you take into example the Committee on the Rights of the Child, right? They were asked. There was a case. I'm not going to enter into the merits of the case, but about children's rights and the protection and the climate crisis. And there was a huge campaign, and of course there was also a big role played by art in childhood. And I was struck by the fact that the committee answered, approached that case, that case, not just with a sort of more legalistic answer, but also provided different separate concurrent answer that was digestible by those who are not necessarily experts in law. So I think that the added value of art is to sort of make language of campaigns and a language that can be understood, because sometimes we're saying the same thing, but unfortunately we're looking at the same thing from different disciplines. And I think that the conversation can be a bit difficult. So I think that's the immense power of art, right? That is sort of a unifying language somehow. I think that's the merits of the festival, of course. Did you
anything on the non-traditional evidence point?
Yeah, the non-traditional evidence. Sorry, I think that it's the typical case. I mean, and if you can, then at the end of it, I will give you the details of this case I was referring to. I had this amazing group of women from Alaska, and they were collecting evidence linked to environmental related health issues linked to military debris and contamination of water, and it's I was impressed. So they set up a website, and I can share it with you. And with that evidence, they're bringing a case also before the special rapporteur on toxics and human rights, collecting that evidence through sort of a sort of community-based approach to it. So I think that's quite impressive. And on the what was the last
planetary boundaries? What's the future where we live within our planetary boundaries?
That's a good question.
We can come back to you on that. Defer to Joanne.
Yeah, I'll take a minute for that.
Okay. Right. Thank you for all the questions, particularly the one on the role of art. 'Cause Nina and I have been talking about this for a few days now. And I think, you know, as academics, we tend to live in our heads. We tend to live in this rational sphere. It's how we're trained in academic thought. It's how we're trained to think about what the appropriate warrant of evidence is, weight of evidence. It's how we're taught to think about what a compelling argument is or isn't. And I think it's difficult for us to step out of that as academics, or as people who are trained in, you know, academia, and what is a good argument versus perhaps an underdeveloped argument, as we might call it. And I think it's also difficult for, at least for me, one of the reasons that I became an academic is it's difficult for me to take my body seriously as opposed to my mind. So I spend a lot of time living in my brain, in my mind, in my intellect. And so even when I do write about feelings or emotions or affect, in which, you know, bodies might respond to international politics, I'm doing so via writing and reading, which are very intellectual in the head. And I think art can challenge a lot of that for academics. And in fact, you know, are way better than us in trying to figure out how to do that, how to give priority to some of our senses over others. Because in academia, I think the senses that we give priority to is reading, is sight, and writing also via sight. So that's a communication over sight. So how do we give perhaps more weight to other senses, but also more weight to other ways of knowing, and other ways of making arguments? And I think the question about sort of non-traditional types of evidence is one I often have, is how do we have a non-traditional archive, for example? I work with a lot of archival material, but a lot of things are left out of archival materials. Not either diplomats have not thought they were worth mentioning, or not archivists at some point had thought it wasn't worth collecting, right? So then how do we work with the lack of evidence, the absences in international politics? And I think art and turning us towards imagination and different ways of thinking can really help us come to grip with those sorts of things. And I'll say a final thing that I've been thinking about is liminality. It's something I think intellectually we as academics talk about, sort of moving in between boundaries and spaces, but art actually can show us how it might be done, which I think we're not particularly as academics very good at. And I think Nina has some thoughts that hopefully she'll also share with us. And she has a beautiful quote that she'll share with us. In terms of the future, so such a hard question. No, I don't. I would say at least maybe two things from my thinking, just back of the napkin thinking. One is getting away from essentially our fetishization for economic progress. That we can only imagine how well we're doing as a society by either GDP per capita, some kind of measure of, well, are we better than last year? If it's dropping, ooh, something bad is happening. And is there a way we can measure progress through something else? Or how society is, the health of a society through something else? To recalibrate our desires, perhaps that's maybe part of it that has to be done, because we all desire economic well-being, right? Like that's been inculcated into us from an early age, that why do we go to good universities? Why? Because we want to go get a good job. Why do we want to get a good job? Because we want to make enough money to get all the things that we want, whether that's a house, a car, etc., right? To travel the world. Those are things that we've desired. So how do we then recalibrate those desires? I think, must be thought about in this livable planet future. And for me, as an international relations scholar, the other thing, obviously, is to do something about this state-centric decision-making that we have as a planet. And I don't know how that's done, because we're so ingrained in, at least for the last 200 years, of thinking about, well, states as the units of legitimacy in which then we can come together as a planet to talk about things. But maybe, well, I think in this livable planet future, there needs to be other ways of representation than just through the state. In terms of recommendations, so I've been on an Ursula Le Guin kick, as Nina knows. So my recommendation is, Ursula Le Guin wrote a short novella called "The Word for World is Trees," or Forest. Sorry, it's Forest. And it's a short novella. And for those of you who have seen Avatar, so supposedly it's like loosely based on that, but I think the novella is much more sophisticated and complex, in which there is a planet is somewhere in the in the universe that has a different relationship with nature, and therefore you might find some inspiration in that, particularly in gender relationships, because so often nature is gendered, right? In that nature is often gendered feminine. Although specific elements of nature can be gendered masculine, like the sun oftentimes is gendered. We were talking about this today. Sun's gendered masculine, but while the moon is often gendered as feminine, but Mother Nature itself and the planet is often gendered feminine. So I think maybe that could be, I think, a good recommendation for rethinking that.
Thanks, Joanne. I'll add just a little bit on from the festival, like shaping why I wanted to even run this festival, because I think that's relevant both for our conversation. Also, thanks for the question as a whole about the role of art in shaping academia. And for me, I think building very directly on what Joanne said, there's something beautiful about suspending disbelief. As an academic, you're there to criticize, and you're there to say, well, does this make sense? How does it work? And the act of art isn't to say, is this going to happen? Is it a fact? It's kind of projecting something and playing with it and just suspending that moment where you're like, oh, I don't believe this. And for me, the joy of that was like the Friday night performance, seeing the School of Interspecies Diplomacy and werewolfish studies, werewolfish. So werewolves and fish. And you're like, what is this? How does this work? But the point is not to say, will this work? How you put in practice? It's to go along with that journey and see where it takes you. And I think there's a joy in that, because we're trained, just like we heard from Joanne, to think in certain logical, causal ways, which is useful. I'm not saying we shouldn't train in that way. Obviously, I'm an academic. I've dedicated my life to thinking in that way. But just like anything, having a balance, having an experimental place might give you different imaginations. And I think that's the second point that for me is really strong about the festival, is it also shaping who you are when you look out at the world and how you look out with the world. And so the quote that you referenced, I'll read again because I found it really powerful. It's a Nigerian artist, Ben Okri, who wrote, "Art changes the spiritual place that you stand and look from rather than what you're looking at." So it gets you into a different space of how you look at the world. And I think that to me is really an inspiration for thinking about the different ways over time and across countries that people have looked out at a tree. It might be as simple as that, or a river. So in Māoridom, in the Māori culture, when they think of a river or talk about a river, they say, I am the river and the river is me. It's not a separate entity, it's one. Now that's a very different from a Western, there's the river which is flooding us, right? May or may not be the case. I actually want to do something a bit experimental here. I want you to, instead of gathering another round of questions, to turn back to those groups of people and just spend 2 minutes reflecting what you learned, what you didn't, what questions you might have wanted to ask, something that struck you in the conversation, to just spend a couple of minutes back in that discussion you had at the beginning.
Nice. Was wondering how good it would be for a lot of my colleague, right, like civil law, commercial law, to sort of just plunge themselves into some right non-legal background. So it was very good. I think I was very lucky that when I did my PhD, although I was not in a law, I was not in law faculty, I was in the Norwegian Center for Human Rights, where you have lawyers, philosophers, economists, social scientists, and I think that to me it helps a lot. I mean, it's sort of like to accept the complexity, to accept that you cannot put things into labels and pretend that that has to. I think the question on gender made me reflect on. We had a session on gender on rights of women and the environment, and there was a very good professor who's doing gender studies and international environmental law. And she was talking about indigenous women. And because my course caters through NGO stuff, international organization stuff, so it's not like students, right? So and we also always have like 3 or 4 people with scholarships coming from different countries, and there was this woman, and she's part of an indigenous community in South America, and so this lady, she was doing it, like, she did a great job. She was just lecturing on indigenous rights and giving a definition of indigenous people. And this woman, this participant, she raised her hand like, where does this definition? I mean, this definition doesn't reflect me, for example, right? So like, who came up with this definition? Because it doesn't make any sense. Yeah. And I thought it was a very fair point, right? And my colleague, she was like lecturing, and she's a lawyer, and so she was a bit puzzled, like, so of course we like that's what's written in the document. Yeah, that's like go to the Declaration of Indigenous People, like, and that's what and that's, I think that's exactly the cycle we have to break. To accept. I mean, you talked about state-centric approach. We don't even manage to have an international court saying that companies have and responsibility. We don't manage to get that because otherwise it would imply obligations, and states are very shy about it, and we get that companies to yeah. But and it's such an intellectual reason, and I think that there's this very good professor of international law, Rosalind Higgins, who used to call this issue of subject and like an intellectual reason. And think that we build this so that it's reassuring, right? It's something, you learn, you open a book of international law, you learn that it's made of states and international organizations, and that's it. Yeah. And then you go and everyone repeats the same story, and every book says the same thing. And it's honestly, I think it's the more you pursue this path, the more you sort of distance yourself from reality. Yeah.
But it's also hard to get out of it.
All right, I think I'm gonna.
Yeah.
Right. So. Yeah. I'm very happy. I'm very happy there's such animated discussion. I'm very happy to let it keep running, but I might round up the formal part of the session so that people who need to go on at 7:30 can leave. But I would love you to all continue this conversation, whether it be over an aperitivo or around the corner somewhere, tomorrow over coffee, or wherever and whenever. Did anyone just want to throw back anything? We don't have to collect everyone's, obviously. It's just anyone wanted to share anything that struck them or came out of the conversation. Everyone's very shy. You guys need an aperitivo. Obviously, everyone needs a glass of wine.
Just pour 2 or 3 glasses.
I know. Yeah, go for it, Jess.
Talk a little bit about the sustainability of imagining the indigenous person in nature and not thinking of it in the sense of like, oh, these are separate communities, because we talk about land and food sustainability and all of that stuff. But I'm also wondering, at this point in the world development, it's even possible to think of a world where there's any such thing as pure nature, and how do we conceive of a world where all of us live in a cooperative style of nature? How do we think of ourselves not and get a relationship with nature that isn't something more
Destructive.
where we find that balance?
Yeah, and it's a good question. I feel like it comes back somewhat to Amalia's question about living within future planetary boundaries. And Joanne is definitely,
My job is done.
she says her job is done. There's a lot of good writing. So remind me, a colleague of mine who I'll be seeing at the University of Palermo shortly, she's written on biocultural rights and some of these ideas about indigenous peoples and indigenous rights to particular, plants and medicines and how they can be capitalized on, but also how can we conceive them. Julia Sayeva. Any other final things anyone wants to throw out before we round up? No, well, I'm really delighted to have had this panel. For me, it's a real joy to bring both Joanne and Ludovica to SAIS. They've both been here before, but not together and not shared this platform in this way and this shape. And I think I've really enjoyed the conversation, the questions you've asked. So big round of applause to both Joanne and Ludovica. And just to emphasize, I think today's conversation, the strength of it was understanding what some of the dynamics have been over time, great power politics, the Antarctic Treaty, when did international laws from Stockholm onwards consider it, but also some of the ways we might imagine different ways. And I would kind of encourage you to hold those two parts together. Like, I think that they can be healthy to have that tension to play with, like, where are we now and where might we want to be? And there might be different versions of where we might want to be. And on that very note, I just want to leave one last thought. If you are interested in the final events of this festival, there's a movie at 9:30 tonight at Galliera, which is in Bologna. And it's Green is the New Red. And it's a film about climate activism in Latin America. And it's like, I think the film director will be there. And then there's an event at Unibo on Thursday, Cultural Shifts and Climate Drifts, which is a nicely rhyme, exploring decolonial, post-migrant and multicultural horizons through art. So it's a collaboration between artists and scholars, and it's all on the website, so you can find out more about it. And it's open to everyone. Anyone can come. If you have friends couldn't make it tonight, it's very much open. So thank you all, and thanks particularly to our speakers, and enjoy the rest of your evenings.